Okay, I have Fresca and I've got popcorn, which means we are going to be doing a popcorn review today. And today's popcorn selection is An Evening with Bruce Porter on this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Like all our popcorn reviews, tonight's selection was a viewer request. I would normally do a popcorn review of a video like this. However, a Mormon viewer specifically asked me to do a popcorn review of this particular video. He asked me to do this because he wanted to know about the accuracy of the Egyptology and the archaeology being used in this video. He had some reservations, and I think his reservations were justified. Now, this video features Bruce H. Porter, who is a historian and researcher for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And in this video, he's going to talk about the Book of Abraham, which is a Mormon text written by its founder, Joseph Smith Jr. And the video talks about how Mormonism interacts with Egyptian history and religion. According to the speaker's biography, Porter earned his bachelor's degree in ancient Near East studies from Brigham Young University and went on to receive his master's degree in Middle East studies with an emphasis on Semitic languages. He claims to have studied Hebrew, Aramaic, Akkadian, Coptic, Egyptian hieroglyphics, and other languages, with a minor in ancient Near Eastern religions. His graduate coursework was in the history of religions with an emphasis in Egyptian religion and textual studies. So, what he's going to talk about today, he should know this stuff cold. He claims to have done extensive research on the Mormon scriptures, including the Book of Abraham, and leads tours of Egypt, Israel, and the Mediterranean world. So, this person has the credentials, or at least claiming the credentials that one should have to be able to handle the material he's about to present with deftness and competency. Now, I'm going to warn you that this video contains a lot of Mormon theology. And while I'm not going to mock the theology, I will probably mock some of the archaeologies, as some of it is pretty ridiculous. Unfortunately, we will have to engage some points of Mormon theology because Porter salts it everywhere in this presentation, whether or not it's justified. And where we're forced to engage the theology, I will attempt to do so in a manner that is respectful, but at the same time, try to remain focused in on the truth. However, what I'm going to try to do is cut out most of the Mormon theology and focus specifically on the archaeology and the textual matters. If at some point in the future we decide to do a video on Mormon theology, we will do it as part of our World Religions and New Religious Movement series, not as a popcorn review, just so that we can keep the discussion respectful. Also, you need to know I've cut out large portions of the video, especially portions that involve copious amounts of mutual admiration and flattery. So because of that, we're going to be starting the video at the 14-minute, 15-second point, when the video starts to get into translational matters, where it comes to the Book of Abraham. So with that said, let's get into the video, An Evening with Bruce Porter.
So the catalyst always leads to the revelatory translation. The Bible in Genesis, the translation of Moses, the gold plates, the translation of the Book of Mormon, the questions about John led to the parchment hit up by John. The Egyptian papyrus led to the translation of the Book of Abraham. And these were all ancient records. Even though the catalyst is there, the catalyst instills in the mind of Joseph Smith the questions that are necessary to lead to the revelations and the revelatory translations of these ancient documents. When the translation comes by revelation, there's no need to physically use the catalyst like the gold plates or the papyrus. The translation is by revelation. Emma said that when Joseph was translating, that the gold plates would be wrapped in a napkin or a cloth setting on the table. He wouldn't even look at it. He didn't need to look at it because he's not doing it intellectually. He's doing it by the gift and power of God. And he says that when he says, I've lost the power to translate.
Okay. It's hard to me to just pass by this without comment. When Joseph Smith did his translations of the Book of Mormon or the Book of Abraham, he wasn't even looking at the gold plates or the papyri. The plates were purportedly covered with an opaque cloth or napkin while he translated. He is essentially using the plates or papyri as a tool through which to receive revelation. It's no different than when a medium uses a crystal ball to channel the spirit world. So these, quote, translations are not translations in the truest sense, but a kind of divination through channeling, which is how new religious movement scholars would classify it. Please see Melton, Encyclopedia of Occultism and Parapsychology, 5th edition, pages 39 and 426.
The Book of Abraham is a revelatory translation of an ancient record too, an ancient record of Abraham. And they have found in 1880s and 1890s, they found the Testament of Abraham and the Apocalypse of Abraham that is closely connected to our Book of Abraham. In 1970.
Okay. The Testament of Abraham and the Apocalypse of Abraham were not found in the 1880s and 1890s. Both these works are pseudepigraphic texts composed by the Jewish communities in Egypt during the 1st or 2nd centuries AD, and they've been known since antiquity. The Testament of Abraham has been recognized as part of the traditions of the Beta Israel sect of Ethiopian Jews. It was originally written in Roman-era Koine Greek and has vocabulary similar to the Septuagint and 3rd Maccabees. On the other hand, no group today recognizes the Apocalypse of Abraham, and it only survives in old Slavonic recensions. However, both books were not translated in English until the 19th century. So it is true that we didn't get translations of these into English until the late 19th century, but it is false that they were discovered in the late 19th century. Basically, throughout the whole Christian era, they've been known.
They found in Egypt, Janet Johnson discovered in Egypt a lion couch bed with a man on top of that bed. And in the Egyptian text, it described that man as being Abraham. That was in 1978. Well, the Book of Abraham is a revelatory.
Okay. Concerning Abraham being portrayed lying on a leonine bed, this is not exactly what Janet Johnston found. Terry Mulstein and John Gee popularized the idea that the Book of Abraham came from a textual tradition that associated itself with the Osiris cult. However, this is an idea spun out of empty conjecture. Mulstein's article, The Religious and Cultural Background of Joseph Smith Papyrus I, in the Journal of the Book of Mormon and Other Restoration Scriptures, Volume 22, 2013, pages 20 to 33, is widely cited as proof of this idea. Mulstein and Gee have tried to show that this papyrus demonstrates Abraham lying on a leonine bed. The problem is the tie between who is lying on the funerary bier and Abraham is circumstantial at best. Let's read a translation of this text, because I think that's going to really sort of show why this is kind of sketchy. Okay? We're going to put an image of the entire translation and text up for you to see. Okay? And this comes from the Papyri Demotic Majesty, and it reads, "You bring a shield of copper, this lion, this mummy, and this Anubis, while they seek black scarab, put..." Okay, now that's the part we understand. Then we get into Gnostic gibberish. Ideo Oric Thembito Abraham, that's the Abraham part, who at Planiegeboth Mu Ryu, and the whole soul for her, female name, the female body of her, female name, I conjure by the, and to inflame her, female name, who bore. Write these words together in this picture on a new papyrus. So that's the translation of the text. Okay? Now, there are some problems with this. First, this mummy is identified in the text with Anubis, not Abraham. Second, Abraham was never mummified. He was buried at Mamre, Genesis 23:19, 49:30. Third, the Leonine bed is not really a bed. At least it's not a bed for sleeping. It's a funeral bier, which is a ritual bed used to hold a mummy after the embalming process is complete. Fourth, when the Egyptians identify a figure with a caption, that caption is normally placed on either side of the mummy or above the figure. But on this image, in the original, the text Abraham is beneath the bed. And unlike what we do in the West, where we tend to put a caption underneath a figure, Egyptians almost never did this. So then, what is Abraham's actual relationship to the mummified figure? The fact is, we have no idea, since the text is surrounded on all sides by Gnostic gibberish. This text is a Gnostic demotic magic spell, not an old copy of the Book of Abraham.
Translation of an ancient record. The papyrus became the catalyst that prompted Joseph Smith to begin to ask the questions about who was in Egypt. And those questions led to the revelation that gave us the Book of Abraham and the Book of Joseph that was sold into Egypt. Therefore, the scholastic or intellectual translation of the papyrus catalyst should not and will not be the same as a revelatory translation of Abraham, and we shouldn't expect that.
So what Porter here, in effect, is saying is that the Book of Abraham is a docetic text, where the actual source is a spiritual revelation that was only available to Joseph Smith Jr. As such, this is not, and never can be, a real translation. Since the definition of a translation is taking what has been written down in one language and transferring its meaning into a second language. As a consequence, we have no way of knowing that the translation of what Smith read was in any way accurate, since there is a denial that the Book of Abraham was actually written in the Egyptian papyrus texts that Joseph Smith used. While this might defray some of the criticism that has been leveled against Smith's Book of Abraham translation, in that it doesn't match the papyrus sources, it creates a docetic text that has no tangible correspondence to reality. This having your cake and eating it too puts the Church of Latter-day Saints in the unenviable position of both claiming that the Book of Abraham is not based on an actual human text, and at the same time, they are forced to try to show that the Book of Abraham is based upon historical source texts rooted in traditional Egyptian source texts to give it a sense of veracity. This is the problem of having your cake and trying to eat it as well.
And a lot of people are losing their faith in testimony because they think that the papyrus doesn't say the same thing that Joseph gives us in the Book of Abraham. It's not supposed to. It's a catalyst. And you can look.
Porter keeps using the word catalyst. I don't think that means what he thinks it means. What he really means here is a focus or foci. It is the idea that spiritual or magic power is being channeled through a physical object, like a magic wand, a crystal ball, seer stone, or special glasses. This is not a Christian practice as much as a practice that is similar to what is found in spiritualism and the occult.
Look at this in a simple way. If there was a book written in Greek, and you have this man by the name of Bill who can read Greek and speak English, and there's a guy by the name of Joe who wants to write the things down in this book, he listens to Bill's translation, and then Joe writes it down. Well, that's not any different. There's an ancient book of Scripture. that can't be seen. And by the gift and power of God, or by the Holy Ghost, Joseph Smith receives the revelation of the ancient text, and then Joseph writes it down. It is still a translation. Whether you read it directly from the text or you have the intellectual ability to translate it, it's still a translation because it's an ancient text.
A text that can't be seen. So, trust me, bro. A translation doesn't work that way. A translation takes a piece of text and renders the meaning of that text into another language. A translation doesn't take one piece of text and give you a meaning that is completely different from the source text. So when, quote, Joseph Smith receives the revelation of the ancient text, end quote, he is receiving a completely different and unrelated work from the original source text. That's not translation, that's divination. Smith is divining something completely different from what it says in the source documents that Smith is using, because he's using the source text as a channeling focus.
This is the same way that Moses provides us the book of Genesis. Moses is over 1,300 years after the events of the book of Genesis. And there's only one way that he can give us that book of Genesis, and that's by the gift and power of God.
Okay, the last event recorded in the book of Genesis is the death of Joseph, which took place probably during the 16th century BC, which is only 300 years before the Exodus, not 1,300 years. It's an empty conjecture to say that Moses learned about the events of Genesis through channeling.
Facsimile, too, is often the most targeted aspect of Abraham. Every ancient text Joseph called a translation. However, the facsimiles found in the Book of Mormon, he does not call translations, and neither does Abraham. They're not called translations by Joseph Smith, and they're not called translations by Abraham, or part of the text. They are called explanations by Joseph Smith, and Abraham calls them representations. Egyptian scholars have said about facsimile number 2, and Klaus Baer has one of the best in the United States at one time, said, I can tell you what it says, but I can't tell you what it means.
Okay, this is just getting more cringe. Explanations spelled with an I is misspelled, and that does not inspire confidence. And Klaus Baer's quote, you can tell what it says, but not what it means, is a reference to magical texts. And facsimile 2 appears to be another magical text.
Joseph, on the other hand, giving us an explanation, is telling us what it means to Abraham, not what it says. And there are people losing their testimony over this, which is ridiculous. Abraham, in his book, calls the facsimiles as representations. Even in those opening chapters, he says that they tried to offer me as a sacrifice on an altar, and I will refer you to the representation at the beginning of this record. Even Abraham is using them as representations.
Okay. Then why would you say they are translations when they are clearly not? This kind of misdirection is meant to confuse you into thinking that these are not translations in the conventional sense, and therefore the rest of the Book of Abraham is not a translation in the conventional sense, but at the same time, it doesn't tell us exactly what they are. But even if facsimile number 2 is not a translation, what we see here is Egyptian funerary images. A god with 4 faces, which according to the text says, quote, these 4 gods of the star in the center being worshipped by baboons, the Kepper bark on the top right, and a sacred cow in front of mummified humans on the bottom. This looks like a thoroughly pagan source text to me.
Now, facsimile number 2, and this isn't it. This is one from the Asmodean Museum there in Oxford. It's probably in the Oxford Museum now. I was doing research on Abraham, and I got there in Oxford, and they had just put this facsimile out, or this hypocephalus out, about 2 days before I got there on display. And it's very, very close to ours, because ours has a few, there were a few parts of it missing when it was published in the Times and Season. But it's a resurrection text. It's called a resurrection and an ascension text. It talks, and I don't know whether you can see my cursor or not, but this one starts at the bottom. Ours starts at the top. But it goes back. It says, I am Jabati, I'm Chawet Benben. I'm in the temple of Benben, the very first temple, so exalted and so glorious. The power to procreate. I've become a mighty God in the temple of the Ancient One.
Okay, the text doesn't say that, but let's get to what it does say. First, this is not really a resurrection text. It's an apotheosis text. So, in that respect, it's a bit more in line with Mormon understandings of resurrection than, say, a Christian understanding of resurrection. However, what this text says is rather problematic for anyone who takes Mormonism seriously, because it doesn't exactly line up with Mormon theology. Now, where it says a mighty God in purple on the right-hand side there, immediately before it, the text reads, the sky bull. So the full text reads, worshiping the sky bull, a mighty God. 2 weeks ago, we did a video that discussed the sky bull. For more information about the sky bull, please see the card above. And the text in red reads, O God, who is great in the temple of the pyramid capstone, may you cause fire under the head of Osiris Tasheri Khonsu, Ma'aharu justified. Okay. That's what it reads in the red. Now, Tasheri Khonsu was the name of the person for whom the spell was being cast. And the name means she who is the child of Khonsu, the moon god. And at issue here, it's going to be that term Ma'aharu, which doesn't mean redeemed. It literally says true of voice, but figuratively, it means deceased, dead, dead, had died, is dead. Okay? That's what it means. Ma'aharu has absolutely nothing to do with the concept of redemption. And any Egyptologist worth their salt will tell you that.
And then it tells his name. His name is Tashri Khansa, who has been redeemed. So it's the resurrection.
It's a her, not a him.
Text. And then it's the ascension text in the top part. This is the Rakia, the bird there that's ascending through the heavens into perfection. And it talks about life, eternal life, and it talks about death and the grave down below. This is an aspect of what Abraham is trying to get across to us. He's trying to tell the record of Abraham. The record of Abraham is a record of his endowment. Those chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. Abraham is trying to tell us that, look, I wanted the endowment that the fathers had. I wanted to receive it, and I knew a lot. I possessed great knowledge, but I wanted to possess greater knowledge, so I could be a greater follower of righteousness. And so, in that hypocephalus, in facsimile number 2, Joseph gives us an explanation of what these things represented to Abraham that's talked about in his book. And Abraham is the only scripture that we have that's illustrated. It's a great thing. And these explanations are canonized, whether we understand them or not. So spend some time looking at it. I'm just going to go through it.
Okay. This is pretty imaginative explanation, but it really doesn't have anything to do with images so far.
So this is the explanation of facsimile number 2. And I want to just kind of outline what it shows. It shows here that there is a place where God resides. Abraham is telling us not only is he available, but he's locatable. So he says there is a place where God resides. Next to that place is a governing planet named Kolob that governs planets, and the Lord tells Abraham, like unto the one whereon thou standest. And Kolob.
Yes, that is Mormon theology. That Adam God was once like us, lived on the planet Kolob until he became a god of his own planet, which happens to be this Earth. Is any of this found in Egyptian sources like Porter and the Book of Abraham are telling us? No.
There's a governing planet, and it tells us in this explanation that Kolob is the last planet, the last governing planet pertaining to time, because where God resides, there is no time. He can see the past, present, and future. And Joseph tells us here that the days on Kolob, one day on Kolob, is as 1,000 years on earth, and it's the last pertaining to the measurement of time, not where God is. It tells us also that Oliblish is another governing planet that has the same revolutions or the same time.
Okay, according to the text of Figure 2, the planet next to Kolob was called Oliblish by the Egyptians. Now, there's no such reference to Oliblish in Egyptian text, even if such a word was phonetically possible in Egyptian. The closest thing even possible in the Egyptian language would be Ribrish. The Egyptians didn't have the letter L, so they would use the letter R as a substitute. Nevertheless, this word is not found in Egyptian sources, so How well known could it have been to the Egyptians?
Reads as Kolob. And then he goes on to explain in this that we get our life and light on earth through the medium of kilphoesis, which then passes out through the medium of K-Evanrash, which then...
Okay, now that's another one that caught my attention. The one found in figure 5, which is Ka-Vanrash. This word would be quite a challenge for the Egyptians, since their language lacked the letter V. Now, this is leading up to a certain issue with the Book of Abraham, which is that it does not appear to be a translation of any kind from Egyptian sources, because these are supposed to be Egyptian words that are using letters and sounds that you don't find in Egyptian. That's a problem. But if the Book of Abraham is not a translation of a physical text, but of a spiritual text you can't see, then why bother to try to locate these things in Egyptian sources? It just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense.
Controls our sun, Inishko Andash, and controlling 15 other fixed suns. And then we finally receive that light and life on earth, which is called Ja'oe, and then Folis, the moon, reflects that light. So we can only see in space, we can only see very little of this. So anyway, facsimile number 2 is not a translation. None of the facsimiles are. They are explanations. Anyway, that concludes the little translation part. And I'm going to move on to the Gospel in Egypt. This is where it begins to get exciting. And you need to know that I'm just going to touch on very little of what's there and what's available and what we can understand. And see, the part I didn't put in here is on the ritual embrace, and it's phenomenal. And when you take LDS people to Egypt and you show them the ritual embrace and how much it shows up, they are astounded that so much of a temple would be on the walls of Egypt. You have to understand Egypt, and we'll go through that. Egypt functioned. They copied. It says the first Pharaoh was a righteous man and sought earnestly to imitate the order established in the days of the first patriarchal reign, even in the reign of Adam. And Egypt was founded upon the higher law, upon the religion of the patriarchs, not the Aaronic law, like in the Old Testament, but the higher law. And so you will see these things in Egypt more than you will even in...
Evidence for any of this from Egyptian sources? None. Absolutely zero. He's just superimposing Mormon theology in a sort of a broad, general way over what he thinks is there in Egypt.
In Israel. A man by the name of Budge, E.A. Wallace Budge, he was the curator of the Egyptian Museum there in London at the British Museum. He was a curator, and he did a lot of translations, not only in Egypt, but in Coptic and other things. He said, there was never a people more prepared to accept Christianity than were the ancient Egyptians, because he was able to recognize the connection between the New Testament and ancient Egypt. And he says there was no one ever more prepared because of the myths of Egypt and the religion of ancient Egypt. There was never a people more prepared to accept Christianity. You may not realize it, but Egypt, after the time of Christ, Egypt was the first country to be totally Christian. Totally Christian.
When you have to use Budge, things are not going well. Okay, Egypt never fully converted to being Christian. I don't know what he's talking about. The North was Christian, but the South continued to practice Egyptian pagan religion until the invasion of Islam. That's just the historical facts here.
Philip, one of the apostles, went into Egypt. The Coptic Church was established there. The oldest Jewish settlement and temple was in Elephantine in Egypt, outside of Israel.
Okay, Porter is mashing up his history here. It was the apostle Matthew that was the one that went to Egypt. Philip went to Greece, Syria, and Asia Minor. The temple at Elephantine was established in the 5th century BC and was destroyed by the 4th century BC. So that temple didn't last long. Remnants of it are still there, but not much of it is left.
Which dates clear back to the time of Lehi leaving Jerusalem. But there never was a people more prepared to accept Christianity, and there's reasons for that. We learned that this Egyptian and the hieroglyphs were even the brass plates that Lehi takes from Jerusalem were written in Egyptian. We read in Mosiah 1, were it not possible that our father Lehi had remembered all these things to have taught them to his children. He couldn't have done it. He couldn't have taught these things except were for the help of these plates, for he having been taught in the language of the Egyptians. Therefore, he could read the engravings, telling us that the brass plates were written in Egyptian. And because he used the scriptures and could read the scriptures, and they were his standard, he could teach them to his children so that they could teach them to their children in order that his posterity could fulfill the commandments of God even down to the presence of time, telling us the importance of scripture, not just the Egyptian, but the importance of scripture.
Okay, what he's just talked about here is a faith proposition, and it's a religious claim. Fine if you believe it, but it's not an archaeological or historical claim that can be verified.
There's three great prophets that live in Egypt. You have Abraham, Joseph, and Moses.
Yeah, about that. Abraham visited Egypt but didn't stay. That whole Sarah is my sister thing brought a quick end to Abraham's Egyptian vacation.
Now, we know Christ was there also, and there's a few other prophets that come down into there. But Abraham, Joseph, and Moses each left us a record. We have the book of Abraham from Joseph Smith. We have the manuscript or the book of Joseph that Joseph Smith translated. The manuscript, it was never published or finished for translation. And a third of the book of Abraham was never prepared before his martyrdom. Joseph was actually working on he was working on the manuscript for the book of Abraham and only prepared two installments for publication and was martyred before he got the third installment done. And he had already done the book of Joseph translation, but he had not begun the preparation for publication at the time of his death. So we have the book of Abraham, the book of Joseph, and obviously Moses gives us the book of Genesis as well as the whole Pentateuch, basically. So we have three great prophets, each with authority and power, each leaving us a record.
Yeah, but you don't have the book of Joseph, do you? Well, I guess 1 out of 3 ain't bad, I suppose. So far, I have no reason to believe that the so-called Book of Abraham really contains anything that Abraham wrote or is even content from its original source texts. And what's being shown here for the Book of Joseph is a photograph of the Papyrus Ani, which is better known as the Book of the Dead. Now, to try to make the claim that you have the Book of Joseph while saying, well, the real book's invisible, but you need the Book of the Dead as a focus, a catalyst to channel the real Book of Joseph, means you don't have it. You don't have it, and you don't have it because Joseph Smith was martyred before it could be channeled and put to pen. So, Porter's making all sorts of claims that he doesn't have the scriptures to back up. So, there's simply no book of Joseph that exists because God stopped revelating that book because Smith was martyred. Now, that does raise the question, if all God needs is a catalyst, why didn't someone else wrap a copy of the Book of the Dead in the cloth and complete the work? Surely the Mormon Church still claims to have an unbroken line of prophets, does it not? Am I expected to believe that the Book of the Dead was left to us by Joseph, when the Book of the Dead is essentially made up of magic spells from the pyramid and coffin texts that existed for at least 1,000 years before Joseph was born? I think I'm going to have some difficulties with Porter's propositions here.
Well, Abraham tells us in his book that Pharaoh signifies king by royal blood there in Abraham chapter 1. But if you read the word Pharaoh, in Egyptian, you can see it up there on the upper left. It's per wer. That's the hieroglyphic there. That's per. That rectangle is per with the door open. That's house. That's the word for house. And wer down below it is the word for great, and it means great house in Egyptian. Now you remember Joseph.
This does not say per wer. It says per aa. Now, where does mean great, but so too does aa. They are synonyms that are pronounced differently. Not only does Porter mispronounce the word, and does so 3 times, the worst thing is that the pronunciation is even being shown on the screen in the second window. A first-year student of Middle Egyptian wouldn't get this wrong. It's like one of the first words you learn in Egyptian. This shows that Porter can't read even the simplest Egyptian. I just don't understand how anyone who has studied the Egyptian language could have messed this up. It's just baffling.
You have to keep in mind, Joseph is giving us this information before Egyptian is even cracked, before there's a grammar for Egyptian or an alphabet for Egyptian. It's being worked on at the same time in England and France, but he's giving us this information before anybody even has an ability to understand Egyptian. And so Egyptologists know from the hieroglyphics that Perwer means great house. Joseph is telling us that Pharaoh signifies king by royal blood.
Porter here claims that Joseph Smith cracked the Egyptian alphabet before anyone in Europe could understand Egyptian. But is that claim really true? Few people know this, but Joseph Smith published a book entitled The Grammar and Alphabet of the Egyptian Language in November 1835. And the contents of the book are nothing but complete gibberish. That is, when you can even get past the grammatical and spelling errors. Here's a couple samples of his language work, beginning with the first paragraphs from page 1. This is called Za Ki O A In Kaish, or Chalcedon Hissa. This character is in the 5th degree, independent and arbitrary. It may be preserved in the 5th degree, while it stands independent and arbitrary, that is, without a straight mark inserted above or below it. By inserting a straight mark over it, thus, it increases its signification 5 degrees. By inserting 2 straight lines, thus, its signification is increased 5 more times. By inserting 3 straight lines, thus, its signification is again increased 5 more times than the last. And counting the numbers of straight and preserving them, or considering them as qualifying adjectives, we have the degrees of comparison. There are 5 connecting parts of speech in the above character, called Zaki on Hish. These 5 connecting parts of speech for verbs, participles, prepositions, conjunctions, and adverbs. In translation, this character, this subject must be continued until there are as many of these connecting parts of speech used as there are connections or connecting parts found in the character. But whenever the character is found with one horizontal line, as at the subject must be continued until twice, 5 times, the number of connecting parts of speech are used, or the full sense of the writer is not conveyed. When 2 horizontal lines occur, the number of connecting parts of speech are continued 5 times further, or 5 degrees. And when the 3 horizontal lines are found, the number of connections are to be increased 5 times further. The character alone has 5 parts of speech, increased by 1 straight line, thus 5 by 5 is 25 by 2 horizontal lines, plus thus 25 times 5 equals 125, and by 3 horizontal lines, thus 125 times 5 equals 625. Huh? What does that gibberish mean? But this is not unique to Joseph Smith's work on the grammar of Egyptian. He also says on page 19, Beath. 113 is a character is found in the 1st degree. It has an arbitrary sound or signification, which is Beth, and also a compound, which is Za. 114, and comprises one simple sentence for its signification. It is only increased or lessened with its signification by its connection with other characters. One connection with another character gives it a compound signification or enlarges the sentence. 2 connections increases its signification, still. 3 increases it still. 4 increases still. 5 still. This is as far as a sentence can be carried in the first degree. It is arbitrary sound. It may have more sounds than one, but it cannot have more than 5 sounds. When it is compounded with others, it can only have one sound. Okay, now Porter has made the claim. Understand, Porter has made the claim that Joseph Smith not only deciphered Egyptian, but understood it. I don't even know where to begin with this nonsense. This has no similarity to actual Egyptian whatsoever. It's clear from Joseph Smith's discourse on the grammar and translation of ancient Egyptian that Joseph Smith Jr. had no competency at all in the Egyptian language. On the other hand, Champollion deciphered Egyptian in 1822, with the first real Egyptian grammar being published in 1836. Basically, a year after Smith published this nonsense. Joseph Smith began his translation of the Book of Abraham in 1835, and he finished it in 1842. So, I'm not quite buying the idea that Smith was the first to decipher the Egyptian language, even if Porter appeals that it was through miraculous means, especially given the lengthy qualification earlier on in this video that the Book of Abraham is not really a translation. Again, is this a translation or not? Did Joseph Smith understand the Egyptian language or not? It's really, really clear from his book on the Egyptian grammar that Joseph Smith did not understand Egyptian. And if this is not a translation but a channeled text automatically translated through a focus, why would Smith even need to read Egyptian? None of this makes any sense at all.
Blood is the house. Royal is great. It's the exact same.
Okay, house pair does not mean blood. Just eisegeting this. It's just there's no sense in which house in Egyptian means blood.
Same thing that he's saying. Now we learn from the Book of Abraham in chapter 1. Now the king of Egypt was a descendant from the loins of Ham and was a partaker of the blood of the Canaanites by birth. From this descent sprang all Egyptians, and thus the blood of Canaanites was preserved in the land. And sprang all Egyptians, and it was preserved. Now this descendant, we learn, is a grandson of Ham.
This is not a translation from an Egyptian source. It's a plagiarism from Genesis 10 of the King James Version. Not only does the Book of Abraham, chapter 1, verse 22, use a syntax that is not found in Egyptian texts, but it preserves the content of the Table of Nations text that is found in the King James Version, but is never found in any Egyptian source.
Or Menes, the land of Egypt being first discovered by a woman who was the daughter of Ham and the daughter of Egyptus, which in the Chaldean signifies Egypt, which signifies that which is forbidden. When the woman discovered the land, it was underwater, who afterwards settled her sons in it, and thus from Ham sprang that race which preserved the curse of the land. Now, if you go back in the oldest myths and traditions of Egypt, if you go back into the oldest ones, Egypt is founded by a woman, and this is a picture of her in both corners, Hathor or Hathor, which you will often see the pharaohs nursing on the udder of the cow of Hathor or Hathor, and that's later stylized into Isis down below in the lower right-hand corner. You can see by the sun disk and the horns there that she represents the first person who settled Egypt. And it's interesting that her son, she put her son on the throne of Egypt. A woman discovers it. She places her son on the throne of Egypt, and his name is Min, M-I-N. His name is Min, and he becomes the first pharaoh. And so every pharaoh that we see depicted is always nursing on Hathor. He gets his right to reign from the mother or the matriarch who settled Egypt. And Hathor, or Isis in the lower right-hand corner, becomes the wife of the symbolic wife of every pharaoh, because that first woman legitimized the pharaoh's reign in Egypt. Now you can see
Now, the Egyptian word for Hathor is Huthor, not Hathor, but that's a niggling point. However, the sun disk and the horns have nothing to do with this being the first woman to settle Egypt. Yeah, in Egyptology, we call this bullshit, bovine pun intended. Hathor wears the horns because she is a cow. And the solar disk is between the horns because she was said to help Re rise up from the celestial river in the morning. There is no evidence from Egyptian myth that a woman was the first person to settle Egypt. Moreover, we lack definitive evidence that Hathor had any sort of cult following prior to the Third Dynasty. Even more problematic is the idea that the first king of Egypt was named Min. Several kings in Egypt are named as first, depending upon the king's list, and none of them are named Min.
Genealogy from Adam all the way down to Ham, and Abraham tells us the first government of Egypt was established by Pharaoh, the eldest son of Egyptus, the daughter of Ham. And it was after the manner of the government of Ham, which was patriarchal, telling us that the government of Egypt was based upon the patriarchal order.
This is nonsense. The Book of Abraham seems to claim that Pharaoh is a proper name of the son of Egyptus. However, both Pharaoh and Egyptus are anachronistic to the text. Both terms come into the Egyptian language long after the death of Abraham. The word Pharaoh is not an extant title or name prior to the reign of Tutmosis III, which is over 200 years after Abraham. And Egyptus occurs first in the Hellenistic period, 1400 years after Abraham. This is a serious problem if you maintain that these names are what Abraham actually wrote in the Book of Abraham. Nevertheless, we should note that the chart on this slide was taken from the Table of Nations in Genesis 10. And it is a polemic that was meant to connote spiritual, not biological descent. So it is not intended to be taken as a literal, physical, biological lineages of these nations. But that's a subject for another video.
And it was because the matriarch plays a key part in that patriarchal order. And that's why Egyptian pharaohs, that's why everybody looks back to that first woman who discovered Egypt. The pharaohs do. And that's why even in the Old Testament, the matriarch plays a key role in the choosing of the patriarch. And so we see this genealogy, Ham down in the lower right, who has Cush, Mitzrayim, Punt, and Canaan. Mitzrayim is the word for Egypt or Egyptus. That's the same connection, who settles Egypt in our Old Testament. So we learn from Abraham, the government was set up after the manner of the patriarchal order. It was a system that Pharaoh knew and was familiar with. He knew and understood it because endowments were given not in temples anciently, but in the family tent, in the family home. And Abraham tells us that that first Pharaoh was a righteous man and sought earnestly to imitate. And Pharaoh, being righteous, knew that the patriarchal form of government was the best, the most inspired, and the God-given form of government. And this system was what's called a matrilineal patriarchy, as it is in Genesis. The matriarch always chooses who the new patriarch is going to be.
A, quote, patriarchal form of government was inspired, end quote. Sounds pretty misogynistic to me. I think there are some rulers in Egypt that might disagree with that statement. For example, Mernith, Sobek Neferu, Hatshepsut, Taweret, and even Cleopatra might disagree with that statement.
As we see in the case with Jacob and Esau coming to Isaac, it's the matriarch who chooses. Sarah chooses with Abraham who the new patriarch is going to be. We see Eve calling or saying that now I've got a man-child from the Lord and who it's going to be. So the story of the nativity in Luke that we always quote at Christmas time isn't supposed to be the story of Christ's birth, but it's the story of Mary to prove that he is the Messiah. I mean, and the story of Mary is the prophecies. Isaiah, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son. Alma and Nephi.
Oh yeah, it has nothing to do with Christ's birth at all. It's all about Mary.
Both say that there is a virgin that's white above all others, and her name shall be called Mary. The matrilineal patriarchy is one that we often don't look at, but it's very important. Now, Abraham tells us also in chapter 1, verse 26, that Pharaoh is a righteous man, established his kingdom and judged his people wisely and justly all his days, seeking earnestly to imitate that order. Not just the patriarchal order, but he's now talking about the religious order, seeking earnestly to imitate that order, the religion established by the fathers in the first generations, in the days of the first patriarchal reign, even in the reign of Adam, and also of Noah, his father, who blessed him with the blessings of the earth and the blessings of wisdom, but cursed him pertaining to the priesthood. So the government of Egypt is set up on the patriarchal order. The religion of Egypt is set up on the patriarchal religion. So Pharaoh, being a righteous man, judged his people wisely and justly all his days. He established his kingdom and sought earnestly to imitate the religion of the patriarchs. Which religion of the patriarchs is not the Mosaic law. It's prior. It's pre-Mosaic law. It's based upon the ordinances of exaltation. He did this even though he didn't have the priesthood or the authority, because he knew it was right, and he was a righteous man. And who wouldn't, being righteous, take that which he knew was true and correct and earnestly imitate it? He knew it was the only true religion.
Pharaoh was a righteous man, so he established pagan polytheism and idolatry. Yep, sense to me.
Another thing we learned in Abraham. Now, Pharaoh being by that lineage, he could not have the right of the priesthood. Notwithstanding, the Pharaohs would fain claim it from Noah through Ham. Therefore, my father was led away by their idolatry, telling us that the Pharaohs would fain claim their authority to rule and reign on earth by their genealogy. You see, this is a statue of Ramses at Memphis, and Memphis is the place not only where Abraham was, but it's the same city where Joseph was. It's the city where Moses grew up. Memphis is here, and it was the capital of Egypt for a number of years.
There's no evidence that Moses grew up in Memphis. All that is just empty conjecture. But I don't understand Porter's idea here that Pharaoh didn't lay claim to the priesthood, since the kings of Egypt laid claim to being the high priest of every cult in Egypt going back to Egypt's earliest times.
But this is a statue of Ramses, and you see that thing that he's holding in his hand. That's a scroll coming back to Abraham in this verse 25 through 27 in chapter 1. They would fain claim that right of the priesthood. That scroll in his hand is his line of authority, which we call, that's the phrase we use in the church. That is going back, showing his genealogy, that he has the right to reign. And every statue you see of Pharaoh with his legs apart, as they are here, which means he's alive.
The legs being apart doesn't show whether a king is alive or dead on a statue. The legs are apart because important relatives, like the crown prince or the great queen, would be carved in the space between the legs. However, we should note that statues were usually only built while the king was alive because of how the funding for these statues was supplied. So while all colossi were built when the king was alive and could still pay for his statues, the legs being apart does not in and of itself mean that the king was alive.
Is showing his line of authority. He's holding that line of authority. And that's what we're seeing right there. Notwithstanding, the Pharaohs would fain claim it from Noah. And that's his cartouche on the end of that scroll.
Wow. The identity of that object is not known. It is seen on the statues of gods, goddesses, kings, administrators, and officials during all periods of Egyptian history. But it is not seen in reliefs or paintings. Is it a scroll? Is it a writing kit? Is it a piece of a rod? Or is it even filler to make it easier to carve a hand in stone? We don't know, and there's not sufficient evidence to say. So it is presumptuous to claim that this is a scroll, when we really don't know what it is.
His family line, his genealogy. So the government of Egypt was patterned after patriarchal. The religion of Egypt was an imitation of the religion of the patriarch.
There is no evidence that the Egyptian religion was styled after the religion of the patriarchs. That's also empty conjecture.
God is not a copier. He's a creator. And each temple needs to represent the creation. And each temple is either built on a hill, or there's what's called a temenos. An artificial mound is constructed, and then the temple constructed on that artificial mound, like in Salt Lake and other temples.
Okay. A temenos is not an artificial mound. A temenos is a marked off area assigned to an official domain, such as the extremity of a temple or a palace. It is often sloped because it was often made as a mound. But specifically, a temenos is the demarcation of space, not the mound itself. And a temenos can be marked not only by a slope of a mound, but also by a wall, a ditch, or even a line of stones.
Because they have to represent that primordial mound, and they all represent creation. That's why zoos were always around the ancient temples. That's why botanical gardens were constructed around temples, and the grounds are there because they have to represent that Garden of Eden after the creation. That's why water is always associated with temples, either in reflecting pools to see the temple in the different worlds, the world of the living and the world of the dead, or the fountains of the waters of life that are connected to those temples. So water, the creation is always an aspect of it. Now remember, Pharaoh, being a righteous man, sought earnestly to imitate that order. The oldest written document in the world is called the Shabaka Stone. And you have it right there in London. It's in the British Museum. As you go into the British Museum, and they generally lay out the museums, and it has been in the past when I was last there at the British Museum. They start with the oldest first, and this is the first thing you see when you walk into the Egyptian collection. It's the Shabaka Stone. It's the oldest written document on the world, and goes back to the first pharaoh, Menes. Goes back. It's written in drama and as a drama. It's written as a play to be acted out in the Temple of Menes in Memphis. It's the oldest written document of the world that we have.
The Shabaka Stone is not the world's oldest document, and it doesn't go back to the first pharaoh Menes. There is not a shred of evidence for those claims. This is an example of out-of-date scholarship. The Shabaka Stone is a 25th dynasty, that's 8th century BC, copy of a decaying papyrus. Homer Smith in 1952 thought it dated to the First Dynasty, calling it, quote, the oldest written record of human thought, end quote. Similarly, Breasted, Ehrman, Zatha, Yonkert, Frankfurt, Wilson, and Lichtime all thought it dated to the Old Kingdom. But today, most Egyptologists think it cannot predate the 19th dynasty. The reason is that it is only from the Ramesside period onwards that Ta becomes associated with Tatenin, which is what we find in the Memphite theology.
Stone was written as a drama or play and was meant to be performed in the temple. And it talks about these things. It even gives stage direction. It says, so and so shall enter from the left and say, and so enters from the right and says this. It gives not only stage directions, but it gives the dialogue. But it talks about the spiritual creation of the earth. It talks about the council of the gods getting together as described in the book of Abraham. It talks about the council in heaven deciding what plan and who's going to be in charge. And there's two brothers that are fighting to be the god of this world. So it talks about those and who's going to be chosen. And it says in the text itself that Ptah, who's the father god, chooses his most beloved son to be the god of the world, to be the god for this world. The brother.
Okay. There's so much wrong here, it's not even funny. The Shabaka Stone does not have stage directions. The stage directions were an interpretation of the column structure of the text. There's nothing in the text that says, come in from stage right. Okay, or stage left. In fact, it doesn't even use the word stage at all. Or even right or left. None of that is actually in the text. So this idea that the Memphite theology is a play is highly contested. The fact that this is a spiritual creation is debatable. And the Council of Gods was Geb gathering the Ogdoad, or the 9 major gods. It wasn't really a council of all gods. Moreover, that Council of Heaven, and I'm not sure how that is different from the Council of Gods, seems like mentioning the same thing twice. But they're not really deciding which brother gets to rule. But there's a more problematic reading of this text that Porter does here, which is actually this idea of the most beloved son, where he says, Horus is being made the most beloved son. That's not in the text. Horus is appointed inheritor of Geb, the earth god, being the firstborn of his firstborn son Osiris. But the text doesn't say because he was beloved. Now, there is one spot in the text that does mention the word beloved. And again, it does not here relate to Ptah choosing his beloved son to be the god of this world. Okay. This comes out of a blatant misreading of the text. Now, one of the titles used for King Shabaka, he's the 25th dynasty king that commissioned this text to be basically copied onto stone. One of his titles is Son of Re, Beloved of Ptah, south of his wall. Okay? So what Porter has done here, he has confused a royal title that was written by the scribe's introduction with what was originally in the Memphite theology papyrus. That title, Beloved of Ptah, south of his wall, is not part of the original decaying papyrus, but it was added by the 25th dynasty scribe. So there is a lot of hinkiness here in Porter's reading of the Memphite theology. It's not a responsible reading, not in the slightest.
Seeks to destroy him and ends up killing him when he's here in mortality. He ends up killing Osiris. That's the manifestation of the beloved son. Kills Osiris. Osiris is then resurrected and exalted, giving all the power to become resurrected and exalted later on. And
okay, now there's a bit of an equivocation happening here. And an equivocation is when you use a word with two different meanings as if they mean the same thing. The Egyptian language does not actually have a word for resurrection. Let me repeat that. There is no Egyptian word for resurrection. This is a concept added by Western translators and interpreters. When Egyptians refer to what happens in the afterlife, they really mean that one is made a god in the next life. So, apotheosis is a better description of what the Egyptians meant. This is distinct from the Judeo-Christian meaning of resurrection, which means to be raised from the dead in the flesh, not as a god per se.
It says in here that the God, Ptah, created the world and all things in it by the word of his power, by the word of his mouth.
That is actually correct. Ptah does create by the power of his mouth and by the power of his thoughts. So it does seem that there is a concept of fiat creation in the Memphite theology. This is one of the few things about Egyptian myth that Porter does get right.
You can't get much closer than this. Each temple represents the primordial of the mound and therefore the creation and the coming together of the world of the gods, the world of the living, and the world of the dead. Christ talks about these three worlds in the scripture when he's talking about what we do in the temple. In Matthew 16, he says, I say unto thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. We're all familiar with that. We often will say that Peter is revelation, or that rock is revelation, which it is in part. But Joseph Smith says that rock is Christ. And if anybody knows what Christ was talking about, it's Peter. And Peter, in his book, in 4 verses, brings up these things about that rock. He says that Christ in the atonement is a living stone. It's the chief cornerstone. It's a stone disallowed. It's the head of the corner. It's a stone of stumbling for those who reject it, and a rock of offense for those who love darkness more than light. Peter is telling us that the stone is Christ. That primordial mound is Christ in the atonement. Now, if you look at this in the Greek, and it says, and remember, it says, I say unto thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock.
Okay. Christ is not a literal rock. He is not a literal primordial mound. The use of the cornerstone here is figurative. It's not meant to convey notions of temple architecture, but a foundation of theology. This is basically overreading a metaphor.
I'll build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. This is what it says in the Greek. This is what it says when you really look at it. I say unto thee that thou art a Petros. Now, Petros is a small stone, like a seer stone. And he says, you're a small stone, Peter, but upon this Petra, upon this stone of creation, upon the center of the world, upon the navel of the earth, upon Christ in the atonement, am I going to build my church. And then it says, and the gates of Hades. It doesn't say hell in the translation. It says Hades. Well, Hades is the spirit world. He says, and the gates of the spirit world, the world of the dead, because I'm going to build it upon Christ, the world of the dead will not be able to remain closed, will not be able to prevail against those in the world of the dead, will not be able to prevail against the spirit world. That because the church is going to be built upon Christ in the atonement, the spirit world will not be able to hold in those spirits.
Okay, this is messed up. I mean, I know we said we weren't going to get into Mormon theology here, but this is this is a textual matter, so um, that's going to be a problem here. Um, Porter is partially correct about Petros. It's a small stone, but it's not a seer stone. Okay? Uh, there's no connotation of Petros meaning a seer stone. And a seer stone is essentially a small stone that's used for divination purposes. You basically look into the stone and you see something. It's kind of like a small version of a crystal ball. So it's seer stones are often like polished quartz crystals. They're usually fairly clear, but they're tools of divination. Petros has no connotation being a tool of divination. So while a Petros is a small stone, it does not mean a seer stone, not in the slightest. Now, he's incorrect about Petra. Okay? Petra means a large bedrock foundation or escarpment. It does not mean the stone of creation. It does not mean the center of the world. All of this is just pure eisegesis. Moreover, the word prevail, which in the Greek is kataskeuo, means to overpower something. So the meaning of this verse is that Christ is the foundation of his church, and nothing will be able to overpower the expansion of God's kingdom. This does not speak to being able to hold in prisoners or the gates remaining closed per se.
Forever. And then the question is why? Why are the gates of the spirit world not going to be able to hold it? He gives us that answer in the next verse, connecting the three worlds. And I will give it unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven, that whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth. Now remember, the context is the dead. For the living and the dead, whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth for the living and the dead shall be bound in heaven. That's the world of the gods. And whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth for the living and the dead shall also be loosed in heaven. This passage is talking about the three worlds, but it's not talking about revelation. It's talking about temple work. It's talking about ordinances and keys that are going to be given so that people can be sealed in this world. Even though they were dead, they can be sealed in this world to be sealed in eternity and in heaven.
Okay, Porter here does a bait and switch. He infers that the context of Matthew 16, 17, and 19 is the realm of the dead. But that has not been sufficiently demonstrated. Hades can mean more than just the realm of the dead. And it is arguable that verse 18 is talking about the hold of the world that leads people to death against the kingdom of Christ. Therefore, when we arrive at verse 19, the text is really talking about the church becoming center stage in the heavenly drama. So to recast these verses as promoting a temple narrative, temple ordinances, and sealing in the reprobate dead into the next life is to completely miss the point of the text.
Temples in Egypt, there's two different types of temples in the Middle East, straight axis and bent axis temple. Egypt is almost all straight axis temple.
Not exactly true. While many of the surviving temples of Egypt are straight axis, there are also many bent axis temples, especially among temples that predate the New Kingdom. There are two temples at Avaris that are bent axis. The funerary temple of Teti was bent axis. The offering chapel at the bent pyramid is ironically bent axis. The funerary temple of the pyramid of Senefru at Meidum is bent axis. The valley temple of Khafre at Giza and also the funerary temple of Uzur-Kaf at Saqqara are both bent axis. And the Luxor temple became a bent axis temple when Ramses II added his outer court to the temple.
Straight axis is if you come in the front door and keep going, you'll come right to the Holy of Holies. That's a straight axis temple. You come in and you keep going straight. Now, I want you to look at this picture in Egypt, or this temple in Egypt. The water, if you can see my cursor, by these pylons up at the top of the picture, these high walls are pylons. The river, the water used to come right up to them. There's a dock right there for the idol to go out on the waters, but that water is there. This pylon, as it goes up and comes down, this pylon represents, that's the Egyptian hieroglyphic for the primordial mound, the first dry land that comes out of the waters of creation. And then it was open in this part. this center courtyard that you can see just this side of those high walls. That's the open courtyard. That was open. That was the creation room. And then you go into the hypostyle hall, which is next, which is the garden room, each column representing a plant or a type of plant. That's the garden room, until eventually you come to where the tree of life is the highest point, the Holy of Holies, the sanctuary, if you want to call it that, at the highest point.
The complex at Karnak is more complicated than that. What Porter has done is pointed out the final phases of the temple construction. The ruins of the original Holy of Holies at Karnak is behind the currently standing Ptolemaic bark sanctuary. The sanctuary at Karnak has been built and rebuilt many times, and has been relocated with every rebuilding. One of the Tutmosis III rebuildings of the Holy of Holies can be seen at the very bottom of the screen, and that has nothing to do with Porter's six-way axis.
This is important. This is a model of it. Here you have the pylons out on the left, representing there had been water beyond that. Further to the left, the water would come right up to there. These pylons representing the primordial mound. You have the open courtyard, which represents the creation room. And it's interesting that you always have three little temples there, three shrines there, one for the Heavenly Father, one for a Heavenly Mother, and one for the Son, the most beloved Son. Then as you continue.
Okay, those bark shrines are for the Theban triad: Amun-Re, Mut, and Khonsu. We should expect these bark shrines to be at Karnak, because the entire temple was devoted to the Theban triad. Not every temple in Egypt, however, is like this.
If you look at this, this is a depiction of every Egyptian temple. This is actually the one at Karnak, or Luxor. If you look at this, now I want you to look at the ground. Here you see where it's not dark above, that's where it's all open. The water would have been out here on the left. You have the primordial mound, you have the creation room.
Okay, now this particular temple is in Karnak, not Luxor. It's actually the Temple of Khonsu, and not every temple was built like this. Now, the Temple of Khonsu is probably the most consistent with the ideal for New Kingdom temple designs. Most temples, even in the New Kingdom, are not as consistent with the design paradigm found at Khonsu Temple. Furthermore, the water never came up to the front of this temple. This temple, unlike many others, does not face west to east, but south to north. It doesn't face the river to the west. The front of the Temple of Khonsu leads directly to a processional causeway that leads from this temple to the Temple of Mut and all the way down to Luxor Temple.
Get lower and lower. So you have it open, and then you have a ceiling here, and then it gets lower, and then it gets lower. And then on the top of the ceiling in the sanctuary, it's always painted in blue and carved with stars on the top of it. This becoming the closest point between heaven and earth, where covenants are made, where man communes with God. Those are the key things. It becomes the closest point between heaven and earth, and
that's very poetic. Not at all how the Egyptians saw it, but very poetic. The Egyptians saw the heavenly realm as the domain of the gods. But the gods of ancient Egypt were not beings that one made covenants with. They were capricious, dangerous, and easy to displease. They were not the kinds of gods that were good by nature. And man did not commune with the Egyptian gods in their sanctuaries. It wasn't that kind of religion.
Looking right through the same temple, and you can see the Holy of Holies, that dark door in the very...
That's not the same temple. What he showed before was the Temple of Khonsu. That temple is located south of the main temple complex and to the west of the 9th pylon. What he's showing you now is the first pylon of the Temple of Amun-Re. Porter can't keep his temple straight.
Back is the Holy of Holies on that. And this is a picture of different Holies of Holies, different temples, where the god was, and, or where the idol was. It would have been Amun in most of the places here.
Amun worship was not quite as ubiquitous as Porter suggests. To state that Amun was the god that was worshipped in most places is grossly inaccurate. First, the most popular forms of worship in Egypt were Hathor worship, followed by Thoth worship. Second, worship of particular deities was distributed according to geography and even to some extent by profession. Thebes had more temples to Amun than the rest of the country because Thebes was the cult center for the Theban dynasty, who made Amun the royal cult. The central god or goddess of any temple depended on where the temple was located and who was participating in its construction and its worship. For example, the bottom right picture is from Edfu Temple, where Horus the Elder, not Amun, was the preeminent deity. So what gods were worshipped in what temples is going to depend upon where you are in Egypt and which god was being worshipped locally.
On the outside of the Holy of Holies, at that same temple, on the outside, there is depicted the ordinances that the Pharaoh has to go through in order to participate, in order to become a son of God. And there's 4 main vignettes at the top, as well as others, but the 4 main vignettes are the highest and most important. And there is a washing, an anointing, an acceptance, a presentation, and then entrance into the presence of God. Here you can see it here. There's a washing of water on the left. There's the anointing of the oil, the 7 parts of the body they call the blows of life. The acceptance, he's been true and faithful in all things. Then Thoth is doing the presentating of the person, as well as, I mean, you have these are the escorts or the guides. Thoth is doing the presentation, and then the final one is the Pharaoh in the presence of God, in the presence of Amun. So you have these 3 different ones, and here you can see the washing and the anointing a little closer. That's taking place. The acceptance, he's proven himself in all things, and then the presentation, and then finally in the presence of God, where God is giving him the blessings, the very powers that make God God. That's all.
Okay, this is not a temple ritual to become a son of God. At least, that's not its primary purpose. This is from the Naos of Philip III Arrhidaeus. This chapel was probably built by Ptolemy I on behalf of Philip III, since Philip III never went to Egypt. It is a coronation chapel, a chapel that recounts the coronation ceremony of the king. So while it is true that every king of Egypt is a son of Re, son of a god in that respect, that transformation of becoming the son of a god takes place when the Horus bird flies from the deceased king and settles upon the new king. The coronation ceremony is a formality that recognizes the new king by having him wear each and every crown of Egypt. It should also be noted at this point in Egyptian history, the divine status of the king had reverted back to being a god in potential and no longer a god with the powers of a god. So this is something that sort of switches back and forth with the history of Egypt. And sometimes the king is seen as a god in potential, but not an actual god until he dies. Other times in Egypt, the king is seen as being a god with full powers of deity while he's on the throne. In this particular period of time, it had actually reverted back to that idea that the king is only a man, but will become a god upon his death. So he doesn't actually receive the powers of divinity in this ceremony, because the theology of Egypt had changed back.
Moon in this particular. Below this, we see the god is always covered by a veil. That's when you see this on the outside, it's interesting because there's always this veil cloth, even though the building, the container, the ark itself would not.
It's actually not always the case. The veil does not appear until mid-Dynasty 18. In early Dynasty 18, you don't find these veils put on sacred barks.
So this is the washings of the waters of life. We see in many, and this is the anointing with the oil. They would anoint the person on the different parts of the body, from the head down to the feet, the nose, the mouth, the chest, so that those parts of the body would function correctly in a celestial resurrection.
Okay, now the problem here is that this scene is not in any way talking about celestial resurrection. And how we know this is it's not even talking about a deceased king. This is a living king. And how do we know this? because the images are taken from a Mamisi temple. Now, a Mamisi temple, these were small temples that were first built during the late period to commemorate the birthplace of a god. Often when the king is portrayed in a Mamisi temple, he is depicted as the proxy for the god, so that the king vicariously fills the place of the god that's being born as a confirmation of royal power. So then, rather than preparing the king for death in these images are portraying the exact opposite, getting the king ready for a long and successful reign as king over Egypt. So these images are in reference to a living king, not a dead king, and not a soon-to-be dead king as such. Very, very different historical context.
When he comes forth out of the grave. Well, anyway, that's the gospel in Egypt. I've gone through it pretty fast. We didn't get into some of the things that will really change your life or change your outlook on the gospel in Egypt, like the sacred embrace and the ritual embrace, but maybe there might be another time. Remembering that Budge wrote, there never was a people more prepared to accept Christianity than were the ancient Egyptians. The important thing you need to know is that I know and understand Joseph could not have come up with these things that we have. He couldn't have done it. That first Pharaoh, there's similarities there because that first Pharaoh was a righteous man and sought earnestly to imitate that order. Things go by diffusion. There's two theories of the way that religions that
Porter is going to assert that the first Pharaoh was a righteous man as absolute truth, even though he has no other evidence for this than Joseph Smith say so.
Why there's so many different religions. One was purported by a mythologist, trying to remember his name, Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell, he was an atheist. He's not anymore. He's passed away. But Joseph Campbell was an atheist, and he did more study on the myths of different cultures than anybody else. And he realized that the same myth was everywhere in every ancient culture, that there's a father god. He has a son that's most beloved. That son is hated by a brother and ends up being killed by his brother. And that the beloved son rises again, is resurrected again, giving hope and salvation to mankind for life after death. He recognized that it was everywhere. He even wrote a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces, because it's the same story with 1,000 different names. But being an atheist, he didn't know what to do with this. So he said that because we evolve, he felt that we evolved, and he said because man evolves, the religion of man evolves the same way. Therefore, the same story is going to show up when it's unrelated in time and space. Well, the other theory is diffusionism, which we know is true. And diffusionism is that the first man received his religion and faith from God, and then it diffuses through the rest of time. That diffuses down through time and wickedness and change. Things are changed, names are changed, even ordinances are changed. And so we know that that's right. Now, if that's true, which we know it is because of our pearl of great price, then the best way you can look at...
Okay, how do we know the second option is true? And why must there be only two options? This seems like a bifurcation fallacy. Couldn't there be a third option? And the evidence Porter presents of Joseph Smith's words being true in the Book of Abraham just happens to be another work by Joseph Smith, The Pearl of Great Price. A stronger standard of evidence for the Book of Abraham being true might be better external evidence. Just saying.
The original religion, from a secular point of view, is to go back as far in time to the most ancient culture that there is and look at what they're doing and why they're doing it. And that's Egypt. That's Egypt. The next place would be Mesopotamia. And so that first Pharaoh, being a righteous man, sought earnestly to imitate that order. And this is why...
The only indication that the first Pharaoh was a righteous man doesn't come from Egyptian religion. It comes from Joseph Smith. There is no small degree of question begging here. How do you know the first Pharaoh was righteous? It says so in the Book of Abraham. How do you know that the Book of Abraham is accurate about the first Pharaoh? Egyptian religion says he was righteous, except it doesn't. Egyptian religion says absolutely nothing at all about the first Pharaoh. And we don't even know who Menes really was to begin with, if he even was the first. Was Menes another name for Narmer? Could be. Was Menes another name for Hor-Aha? Could be. Was Menes a mythological aggregate of both? Could be. All we know was that Menes was not the first king of Egypt, since several kings preceded him in the Nagata III Dynasty 0 period. So really the only thing we know about the so-called first king of Egypt, Menes, is that he wasn't first. That's it. We don't know if he was righteous. We don't know if he was a scumbag. We know absolutely nothing. He might have built the first city of Memphis as a capital. That's possible. The city of Memphis does seem to be named after Menes, Men-Nefer. But apart from that, we know almost nothing about Menes. Yes, the name appears on pieces of potsherd, but we don't know who they're connected to. And they don't seem to be among the earliest kings of Egypt. So what we do know about the so-called first king Men was nothing at all, except he wasn't the first king. That's about it.
Judge, the curator of the Egyptian collection there in London, said there was never a people more prepared to accept Christianity than were the ancient Egyptians. Joseph didn't know anything about Egypt. He didn't know anything about Jerusalem. And the things that he gave us are connected directly back to Adam and the things that Adam's received. And know that I know that these things are true, that Joseph is a prophet, that he gave us these things.
Okay, so how are we expected to know that Joseph Smith was telling the truth? Claims to be a prophet and receive these revelations by divine visions. And it's claimed that these revelations come to us through Egyptian source texts. But there is little to verify these revelations using Egyptian archaeology. That's an evidential problem.
These things are inspired. These things that we have, our religion, our salvation, and our exaltations are concepts that go back to the very beginning of Adam. There was an ancient text discovered called the Apocalypse of Adam, and in it says Christ appears to Adam after the fall, and he says, and Christ says to Adam in this ancient text, he says, "You wanted to be a god, and I will make you a god, but not now, not yet. You must die, and I will be born of your progeny. I need to come. And then the time will come that I'm resurrected, and you will be resurrected." And then he says, "And I will set you on the right hand of my divinity and make you a god as you wanted to be." I mean,
oh no. It's terrifying that Porter uses the Apocalypse of Adam to support his case. The Apocalypse of Adam is a Sethian Gnostic apocalyptic gospel. It's part of the Nag Hammadi library. It's a Gnostic text. It's not a text that anyone should trust ever. Wow. I mean, not only is it late, it's full of Gnostic ideas. Moreover, that promise to make you like a god from the Apocalypse of Adam, that sounds really familiar. And very, very familiar. Quote, "And the serpent said to the woman, 'You shall surely not die. For God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.'" Quote.
Budge could easily say that the Egyptians were prepared to accept the traditions of Christ better than anybody else.
Could you just, if you're willing, you just pre your presentation, you were telling us the impact that your presentations had on some of the Egyptian people. Would you be willing to share that again, just for the sort of more general audience?
Yes, I was at the Temple of Karnak, and there is as you go into the Holy of Holies, there's two columns on the outside, and there's 6 depictions, 3 on one side, 3 on the back side, 6 depictions on each column, so a total of 12 of the god and the Pharaoh embracing each other. The feet are together, the hands are on the shoulder of both. And if we ever do another one, I'll actually show you the pictures of these things. But the god's his hand is up like this. I don't know if you can see that. His hand is up like this, facing him like that. That means there's speaking going on, and in that speaking, they're giving what I call the Abrahamic covenant of priesthood and posterity and inheritance that we see in the Old Testament. they're bestowing that upon Pharaoh. The God has to bestow the powers that make God God on the individual so he can come into the presence of God. He has to be that.
Okay, there's nothing in Egyptian religion that states that a person has to be given the attributes of God to be in the presence of God. This is just Mormon theology being grafted onto Egyptian religion. This idea that you had to have the attributes of God to interact with the divine is alien to Egyptian theology. We see priests interacting with Egyptian idols, Egyptian gods. They basically take the idol out of the sacred bark and put it in the nail set back every night. There's no special sort of divine qualities that priests have to do this. So this is just anachronistically superimposing Mormon theology onto Egyptian religion without warrant.
And so one of the guides, and you always have to have the local guides. The guide was there, and he was going through the history and stuff, and then he would always turn the time over to me, and then I started explaining what was going on and what was taking place, and how the character of the Pharaoh, they call it the negative confessions in the Book of the Dead, how it mattered and what was taking place in this ritual embrace, and how the powers were being passed from the God. It's called mutual embrace. The ritual embrace, there's a ritual embrace, which is ordinance. There's a sacred embrace, which is atonement. There's a mutual embrace where both the receiver and the giver receive power. And we see that in our own scriptures, our Doctrine and Covenants section.
There's no atonement in Egyptian religion.
He just jumps right out at you on that. But I started explaining that, and our guide considered himself an ancient Egyptian believer, not a Muslim. And as I turned around to turn the time back over to him, he's just weeping. The tears are just coming down his face, because he's hearing things and understanding things he hasn't heard before or understood before from the walls of what he felt he understood. I was in a papyrus shop, and they always have the papyrus of Annie, or one of they call it the judgment scene. And I was going through the judgment scene because that was one of the facsimiles in our book of in the book of Joseph. And three brethren had seen the manuscript of Joseph, Elder McConkie, James Talmage, and Sidney B. Sperry. And they all said that the things contained in the book of Joseph were of such a sacred nature that they shouldn't be revealed. And Elder McConkie went on to say that he felt that the things in the book of Joseph were what led to the restoration of the endowment at Nauvoo. And so they have these papyrus that are the judgment scene, like the facsimile that would have been in the book of Joseph. And so I'm going over this papyrus, explaining where the dead person is and how his character is being judged and weighed, and the great devourer there. And then what is said when he's presented, there's always a guide, there's always an escort, and he's brought to the veil. And then I read to him off the papyrus what is being said at the veil by the escort to the God on the other side. And I mean, it's just said, I can't read.
Porter couldn't read Egyptian to save his life. I wouldn't trust a thing this guy says. His readings aren't competent. He's using the Egyptian text as a foil for Mormon religion. There's no atonement ritual in Egyptian religion, so I don't even know where he got that from. That's just bizarre. Now, if you happen to believe Mormon theology, that's between you and God. But I would say the same thing if someone from the historic Christian faith was abusing Egyptian texts in this way. It's irresponsible.
Remember it exactly, but just to give you, it says this person, the dead person, he calls him the Osiris Ani, the Osiris Ani, meaning that he's gone through everything. He's ready to become a god. He's ready to become like Christ. He says this Osiris Ani has been true and faithful. He's not sinned against any god or any goddess. He's done everything according to the counsel of the decree of the gods. And there's 12 gods setting up at the top who are in judgment over the.
Okay. One of the things we do have to keep in mind is Osiris Ani is not a generic term. Basically, anybody who had a Book of the Dead done would have their name filled in the blanks. And these were made like in a factory situation, where they would just sort of do the Book of the Deads and just leave the names out. And then when it came to buying one of these, the customer would then have his name filled in. So it would be like in this particular case, it belonged to the administrator Annie. That's why it's Osiris Ani. But you also got things like Osiris Nephthys, Osiris Teti, Osiris Uzer-Kaf. It all depended upon who the spell was being said for. So it's not just a generic fill-in. Osiris Ani didn't apply to everyone. It was for Annie, the person named Annie. Furthermore, the negative confession is not a denial of wrongdoing. It is a magic spell that absolves you of wrongdoing. It is a magic spell inaugurated through the vicarious power of Osiris. It's the power of Osiris that gives you the magic power to all the spells of the Book of the Dead. And it's that scene, that negative confession, is using the power of Osiris to wipe away all your misdeeds. That's how the negative confession works. It's not a denial, it's an absolution.
Yeah. He says he's done everything according to the counsel of the decree of the gods. And then he said, and then at the end of that little vignette there, it says, may he enter, after Horus explains to Osiris on the other side that he's been true and faithful in everything, he's done everything he's supposed to do. Then the Horus, the escort, says to Osiris on the side, may he enter into your presence and become like the followers of Osiris or Horus forever. That's in that presentation scene. So I'm explaining this in this papyrus shop, and the people are astounded. And then all of the owners of the papyrus shop, all their laborers are all standing around my group. And when they disperse, the owner comes up to me, and 3 or 4 of his people say, can you come over to my desk? I come over to his desk, and he says, can you give me the book where you're getting this stuff from, where you're getting this information from? So I said, I can't give you the book because of law, but I can give you a website where you can go read it anytime you want.
Yeah, I'm sure the papyrus shop owner wants a copy of the book, because good stories sell more papyrus. Okay? Okay, we're going to stop it here. When it comes to Egyptian archaeology, I think we've encountered a new low bar. Again, I'm not talking about Mormon theology, but the superimposition of that theology over Egyptian religion does no one a service. It doesn't help Mormons, and it certainly isn't a faithful representation of what the ancient Egyptians believed. So, there you have it, our popcorn review of An Evening with Bruce Porter. We hope you enjoyed this video and you learned something. Thank you very much for watching, and we will see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Good night, everyone.